House Speaker Paul Ryan is retiring from Congress, and today the Wisconsin Republican gave his farewell speech in which he offered more of the shtick he's been honing for decades. He's a think tank intellectual, a policy guy, a problem solver who rolled up his sleeves to fight against the corrosive influence of politics. Paul Ryan's built an entire career around what has been for Republicans a very successful con. Since before Ronald Reagan, the GOP has insisted it is the party of limited spending, balanced budgets, and low deficits. That has never actually been true at all. But Ryan managed to convince a lot of Americans otherwise, including a lot of reporters. Here's the truth. Ryan began his career pushing for more spending, not less. During George W. Bush's first term, he even mocked the green eye shade austerity wing of the party that fears increases in the debt. Ryan was an enthusiastic backer of Bush policies that exploded the deficit and debt, including the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and the Bush tax cuts, both rounds, which Ryan argued weren't big enough. He was also, get this, the deciding vote for Bush's costly expansion of prescription drug benefits. But then something changed. I don't know. Oh, right. Barack Obama became president. And suddenly Paul Ryan became an evangelist for fiscal discipline who earnestly cast the debt as an existential threat.
If you take a look at that chart, the red tidal wave of debt, Sean, this is the most predictable economic crisis we've ever had in this country. It's a debt crisis. Our debt literally gets out of control, and it ends the American dream as we know it.
Ryan's solution, of course, was to dramatically cut Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. He never succeeded, but once there was a Republican back in the White House, so weird, he became a lot less worried about the deficit and debt. As House Speaker, Ryan passed spending bills he didn't pay for, pushed through a tax cut for corporations and the rich. The CBO projected would add $1.9 trillion to national debt. And the numbers don't lie. When Ryan became Speaker in 2015, the deficit was $438 billion. This year, with unified Republican government, it's up to $779 billion. And next year, thanks in large part to Paul Ryan and his party, it's expected to hit nearly $1 trillion. Joining me now to discuss Ryan's legacy, Charlie Pierce, writer-at-large of Esquire, and direct from Ryan's home state of Wisconsin, Ruth Conniff, editor-at-large of The Progressive magazine. Let me start with you, Ruth. Paul Ryan crafted this image in D.C. as a kind of wonk, as the rare wonk, as a person who really genuinely believed in what he was doing. I wonder what his reputation is like in Wisconsin, and what is he going back to?
Well, that's a really good point, Chris, because Paul Ryan really had two images. One was in Washington, where he was celebrated as this boy genius. And back in Wisconsin, he would run ads on television saying things like that he opposed trade agreements that exported jobs. In his district of Janesville, where the GM plant closed, they've lost 50% of manufacturing jobs. So this was very important to his constituents. But those TV ads had nothing to do with the votes he cast, which supported every single trade agreement that came before him. So he had two completely different images. He's seen as a friendly guy. He's very easy to talk to. I have watched him give these PowerPoint presentations in his home district where he flashes up these bar graphs, and people sort of try to follow it. And he very quickly explains how trickle-down economics is going to save us, and voucherizing Medicare is not going to be a problem. And his constituents are kind of left reeling. And what they're left with is, wow, this guy's really good at math. I can't follow this presentation. A few grandmas in tennis shoes come out and protest, don't voucherize our Medicare. And then people kind of see him as a nice guy, and he's willing to talk to them. So that's kind of the package you get with Paul Ryan.
That package, I think, Charlie, is part of what helped him sort of kind of cultivate a lot of reporters in Washington. I think with him, it's a little of the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, which is to say that he actually did have significantly more grasp of policy details than the vast majority of the Republican caucus, though maybe that's not saying much.
I think perhaps you're right. He certainly had academic patter down a lot better than a lot of them did. To me, and I grew up in Massachusetts, Paul Ryan is the biggest fake I've ever seen in politics. I mean, nobody's close. If he's not doing this, phony wonk thing, where he's putting together his budgets with magic asterisks, he's going down the old Jack Kemp trail about how much he really cares about poor folks. Paul Ryan cares about one thing and one thing only: shoving as much of the wealth of the United States up to the very, very top of the food chain and making sure it doesn't trickle back down again. That's the summation of Paul Ryan's legacy.
I mean, that's a much clearer through line than deficits and debt, I think, if you were to say, like, look at what he's done and not what he said. Although there is something that I think is interesting in his career, Ruth, which is the Ryan budget. And I think that's the place where, in some ways, he got put in charge and he was too honest about his vision. And in some ways, it was a high point for honesty. So, you know, in 2010, 2011, 2012, it's like, yeah, we want to voucherize Medicare. That was the sort of one of the big ideas in there. And we want to cut a lot of the government spending. And there was no political constituency for it. It wasn't popular at all.
Right. I mean, and this is where the grandmas in tennis shoes came out to say enough is enough with Paul Ryan. He may seem like a nice guy, but this is really dangerous stuff, presented with a smile. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops called him out on that budget and said it was the gospel of Ayn Rand. The faculty at Georgetown actually called it the gospel of Ayn Rand. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops said it does not represent the morality of the Catholic Church, of which Ryan is a member, and which he brought up in promoting these massive cuts for programs that benefited the poor. He also promised an earned income tax credit and went on a very cynical poverty tour, visiting with poor children. And somehow that never showed up in his budget. So there was a lot about that seemed very cruel, really gratuitously cruel to a lot of people.
You know, one of the things, Charlie, about Donald Trump is he recognized more than other Republicans the political peril of Ryanism. This is a tweet in March 2012 that I think holds up well. Paul Ryan's budget is very dangerous to Republicans just before the election. Be careful. And he was right.
No, there's no question about that. I mean, you know, my abiding memory of Paul Ryan will be Joe Biden laughing at him during a debate, which, as far as I know, is unprecedented in American political debating. That was it was an economic discussion that brought out the word malarkey, which again had never appeared in a presidential or vice presidential debate before. Yeah, I mean, you know, with the Donald Trump thing, you know, there's a story about a blind pig and an acorn. But I think, you know, with his kind of feral predator's instinct for political danger,
exactly.
I think Trump was right. You know, and you know, every time Ryan would present one of these budgets, everybody else in the Republican caucus would hide behind the drapes rather than you know, attach themselves to it, because they knew what political poison it was.
That's exactly right. And you saw there's two moments. There's the Bush Social Security privatization fight and the Ryan budget, where there's a sort of uncommon degree of honesty about the domestic political considerations of the Republican Party. And in both cases, you saw massive political blowback. And so, Ruth, what you get instead is a lot of bait and switch, which is basically what we got with the tax bill.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's important to note is, remember, Trump came to Wisconsin, held a huge rally in Janesville, Wisconsin, where Paul Ryan lives, and had the crowd booing talking about Paul Ryan.
That's right.
But the export of jobs, the collapse of manufacturing, and this, you know, focusing on the so-called job creators while letting the jobs go overseas. So that was a very important moment. I think the other thing about Paul Ryan, as much as he has separated himself from Donald Trump, it was really he and Reince Priebus, also from Wisconsin, who were sort of the young up-and-comers, very, very conservative in Wisconsin, who transformed the politics of the state to there was a lot of dog whistle racism in their rhetoric, talked about the safety net becoming a hammock, and that set the stage for Donald Trump, who's more of an Archie Bunker and really loud about it, but same politics and same message to white voters.
All right, Charlie Pierce and Ruth Conniff, thank you both for being with me. Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.